All right. Apologies, everyone, that this is so late. But finally, here's my presentation for the IOWC Conference on Adaptation and Resilience to Climatic and Environmental Changes in the Indian Ocean World, past to present. My presentation is entitled Sorghum, Resilience to Drought in Equatorial Eastern Africa in the 19th to 21st centuries. Now, I'm definitely going to focus on the 19th century here. This definitely reflects my training as a historian and my expertise, but I think there are some lessons possibly that can be brought to the fore. And for those of you who are watching this recording, I would be very grateful if you, for those of you who are watching this recording who are, I suppose, have more training in contemporary issues, for ideas maybe to, if you, I'd be very grateful if you reached out and suggested ways that this could be developed further in the present. But with that in mind, with that being said, let's start the presentation itself. So I want to start with a couple of quotations, and this is about a drought that occurred across much of equatorial Eastern Africa, so present day Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, parts of Eastern DRC. A significant drought in 1883 to 1884. And I've got a couple of quotations here. The first here comes from some missionaries stationed in Kamoga on the southern shore of Lake Victoria. Quote, "The inundation that came last Tuesday was insufficient. People cannot plant their crops. Their drought continues. The king sent some men to consult a sorcerer on the subject. The sorcerer responds that only red sorghum must be sown. A curious means of dealing with the affair." And secondly, another quotation, and this one was written again by the same group of missionaries, the White Fathers, and these guys were stationed at Kipalapala, which is just outside Tabora, right in the middle of present-day Tanzania. And this was a quote that was attributed to the king of Unyanyembe, and Tabora was the capital. "They only need to plant mtama," which is millet or sorghum, "to not starve." Both of these sources highlight the importance of sorghum during a period of drought in the late 19th century in equatorial Eastern Africa. They also point to some quite Orientalist narratives, which can be unpacked further. And I encourage others to do so, but I'm going to, I suppose, reluctantly move past those for the purpose of looking at the environmental aspects more here. So what is sorghum? Sorghum is a crop that, like millet, is indigenous to Africa. It's a grain. It relies on fertile soils, but is extremely resistant to the effects of drought. According to research published in 2020, it is the widely grown grain with the highest water use efficiency under drought conditions in the world. Thus, there are several other reports from 1884 that also indicate the importance of sorghum in present-day inland Tanzania, or mtama. In Uyui, just north of Tabora on this map, the rice harvest failed completely, and sorghum was the only available food. Another quotation from Tabora indicates that sorghum grew in 1884, but according to the White Fathers, there is a shortage on the market, and that they and others became reliant on dried cassava and stores of other crops, most notably maize and rice, which had grown in previous years. And all of these crops, all these stores and the fresh mtama, the sorghum that had grown in that year, were sold at inflated prices. At Karema, meanwhile, on the southeastern shore of Lake Tanganyika, the rice and maize harvest failed, and the Belgians who were stationed there resorted instead to purchasing sorghum at inflated prices from regions in the lake's hinterland. Following from these examples from one particular drought across equatorial Eastern Africa, focusing on central Tanzania and west central Tanzania, I want to position sorghum as a drought-resistant crop that Eastern Africans in the 19th century resorted to, especially in times of drought. At the same time, however, its usage since the mid-19th century has been challenged as a staple, most notably by maize and rice. Maize and rice were introduced to equatorial Eastern Africa during the 19th century. They grow faster than sorghum and millet. They require less labor, and they have higher potential yields than sorghum and millet. Neither, however, are resistant to water stress. That means they are more likely to fail entirely during drought. Their water use efficiency drops dramatically in times of drought. Thus, since the 19th century, there has been a tension in Eastern Africa's agricultural regimes between either A, prioritizing crops such as sorghum and millet, which maintain high societal resilience to the effects of drought, or B, prioritizing crops with high potential yields in regular rainfall conditions, which also heighten social vulnerability to the effects of drought. It's the boom or bust kind of question. And what I'm going to do, because I focus on the 19th century, is start an examination of this kind of tension in the agricultural regimes through an analysis of maize and rice's introduction to the region in the 19th century and the degree to which they supplemented or replaced sorghum as the main staple crop. Now, the data for this is fairly thin. It is reliant on the sources of European, big inverted commas here, European, big inverted commas, explorers, such as Richard Burton, John Hanning Speke, David Livingstone, Vernon Lovett Cameron, and Henry Morton Stanley. These explorers traveled in Eastern Africa from the 1850s to the 1870s, and their sources are among the only written sources that describe the region that we have available as historians. All the authors, all the explorers contributed to and were influenced by the imperial discourse of the era. And for that reason, and as well known amongst Africanist historians, they are highly problematic. But despite their imperial mindset and, quite frankly, their outright racism, they provide snapshots of the regions they encountered. And they frequently describe the crops that they saw growing and being sold in the regions they traveled through, as well as in nearby regions. Other sources that could be possibly useful would be palynological sources. These are studies examining pollen, but they have not yet been conducted in inland regions of equatorial Eastern Africa. To, I suppose, get the most out of the, European documentary sources, I have mapped kind of their records using the maps that they provide to accompany their published sources. The explorers, in traveling and documenting their expeditions in Eastern Africa, also drew maps which represented, to the best of their abilities, the regions that they traveled through. And I've got an example here. This is Henry Morton Stanley's map of Eastern Africa, which he drew with assistance in 1878. And this is based on knowledge that he gained from two expeditions, one which followed this kind of faint red line, which you should be able to see here, in 1871 to 2, and one which followed this red line here around Lake Victoria and then back down here and then across Lake Tanganyika in 1875 to 76. And he also incorporated information from previous explorers, such as especially David Livingstone, in compiling this map. These maps are highly detailed. Pretty much every place he mentions in his accounts in the written source is also positioned on the map, which means descriptions of crops, descriptions of food, available food that are in textual sources can be pinpointed on the maps that they provide. There are, of course, inaccuracies with this map and the other maps as well. You can see on here, for example, that Lake Victoria is very squashed. Lake Mutanzige is completely the wrong shape. Lake Baringa over here is much too big. Lake Kivu over here is much too far to the east, as is Lake Malawi. But through a process of georectification using GIS software, you can actually make it represent a version of geographic reality, which I'm just going to kind of show you and summarize here. We know the location of several places marked on this map. We know the location of Nyangwi and Kasongo. These exist to the present day. We know the location of Uvinza, Msini, Tabora. These are marked on the maps as well. Using GIS software, you can bend the map so that it fits on these places. At the same time, we know the shapes of lakes and the shapes of islands. So you can bend the map to reflect these kind of the real shape. So this is the actual shape of Lake Victoria, and you can bend the map so it reflects this shape here. And I've kind of highlighted like the real places that I bent the map around. And in the following slide, you can see what the new version of the map looks like. It's kind of squashed and a bit wavy, but this nevertheless kind of reflects what a more realistic representation of Eastern African geography than what Stanley originally provided. Then, following this, the next jump is to find the places on the map here that are mentioned in the textual source and attach to them, and then represent what crops are growing in those locations. And here's kind of an example of the whole area that I provided here. And just to kind of talk you through this, here's a place, let's just go here. Here's a place here called Uveriveri, mentioned in Stanley's source in his document relating to 1876 to 1875 to 1877. And he mentioned in Uveriveri they're growing mtama, which is the local word for sorghum, and is sometimes used to reflect millet as well. So we have a red circle here representing mtama at Uveriveri. Other places have a lot more different crops being grown. For example, we can look here at Nyangwi. We have all the crops mentioned: bananas, cassava, maize, mtama, so sorghum, and rice, all being grown or being sold at Nyangwi over here. And this is just a case of matching the description, the textual description in the source, and then putting it on the map as described. This is the map. This is a map for 1876 to 1878 from Stanley's work covering the whole of Eastern Africa. From now, I'm going to kind of focus just on central Tanzania, which is where all the quotations that I mentioned earlier came from. All right, so I always wanted to show you 4 maps now, which refer to different explorer sources as they traveled through Eastern Africa at different times. So the next map here, this is central Tanzania, the regions covered by present-day central Tanzania, using Burton Speaks sources for the years 1857 to 62. Again, we've got lots of mtama, so sorghum around here, got a lot of bananas around here, and some sorghum and some cassava up here in Wefanya. Then if we keep going, we've got from Livingston and Stanley sources for 1869 to 72, a variety of crops in different locations. Again, these are the same kind of coordinates covering the same area. Now still central Tanzania using Cameron's maps and sources for 1873 to 74, a lot fewer records here. And then here's a close-up version of what I just showed you, what I showed you beforehand, from Henry Morton Stanley's for 75 to 76. Now, these maps tell us several things, I think. Firstly, that there is quite a lot of gaps in the data for the final 2 maps, the ones from Cameron and from Stanley. Now, this is for 2 reasons. One, let's start with Cameron. Cameron's accounts of Eastern Africa are basically much briefer than other sources, particularly Stanley's and Burton's. You didn't provide as much detail either in his published sources or in his diaries. that could tell us different crops growing in different locales. The lack of data in Stanley's, meanwhile, reflects the fact that he actually didn't travel through a lot of central Tanzania in 75 to 76. From Jiweni here, he basically went north up to Lake Victoria, and then once he'd been around Lake Victoria, he came down this route here via Usambiro and across here. So actually missed out a lot of central Tanzania. One exception here is Tabora. Obviously, basically he referred to the fact that Tabora rice is being sold in a wide area. That's what this point is here. Although there's some points to draw out here, there's stuff to get from these maps. I'm going to basically discard them a little bit in the following discussion. I also want to draw your attention, thus I want to actually draw your attention more to the significant differences between these two maps, which reflect 1857 to 62 and 1869 to 72. Let's look firstly at the eastern part of the map. So it is the early one. If we look east of Tabora here, not that much cultivation is referred to, particularly in this zone here. By contrast, 10 to 15 years later, we have a lot more cultivation east of Tabora in this zone here. Now, this is a very arid zone. Lots of mixed grains. And in fact, an arid zone indicates that this is probably a strong indicator of why sorghum is probably predominantly in this zone, because it's drought resistant. It's arid, therefore it needs a drought resistant crop to dominate. But yet there's still a significant amount of maize in this pretty marginal zone for maize. It's a very short raining season here, 4 months really, which means if the main rains are even just 1 month late, then the maize harvest will be seriously compromised. However, according to Stanley's and Livingston's report, the early 1870s were generally wet, and this is in line with limnological research as well, which suggests fairly wet conditions. So perhaps maize was abundant at this time because of fairly wet conditions, but there is definitely a marginal zone, probably heightening vulnerability to drought when drought did hit later on, for example, in 1884. If we look at the western part of the map now, from 1857 to 62, I'd probably suggest that bananas were growing wild in much of this zone, therefore required little work, assuming that is regular rainfall. But increased demand for food from passing caravans in this period necessitated an intensification of food production. Thus, farmers turned to grains by the 1860s to 70s, by the end of the 1860s to early 70s. We can see a lot more maize, mtama, so sorghum, and rice. You can also discuss kind of a frontier of rice moving westward here. Here we have it very, very categorically saying that Urunga is the furthest west you can actually acquire rice in what is now central Tanzania. But now you've got it much further west and is growing significantly in Ujiji on the shores of Lake Tanganyika as well. Thus, with the prevalence of not just mtama, but also maize and rice, the kind of agricultural revolution that's going on here kind of indicates a reliance on regular rainfall to develop this increased reliance on grains rather than just on bananas. And this is, I suppose, somewhat supported by developments shown in Cameron's map, which have got kind of a high prevalence of grains in these zones. He's pretty specific, often referring to corn, which can be either sorghum or maize. It's unspecific. Finally, one other thing to draw between in terms of comparisons, Tabora here basically just turns into a major granary of the region, growing all the staple crops of the zone. So overall, during this kind of period, this decade-long period, I think you can generally, very broadly suggest that there is a growing spread of mixed grain farming in the mid-19th century, sometimes into marginal areas. And this was responsive to both economic and climatic conditions. It's generally wet, and there is heightened demand for food during this time as well, caused by commercial expansion. But there's also, I think some regions remained somewhat resilient to drought through the continued growth of sorghum. And this applies to some of the better water areas, but I think there's also some vulnerability as well, particularly in Ugogo, where there's maize being grown alongside sorghum. In 1884, there was during the severe drought, there was a major famine in Ugogo as well. Not just the maize, but also the sorghum basically failed. Also, after 1884, things changed significantly. I'll skip a little bit here. The 1884 drought was severe enough that stores were being overexploited. And when drought hit again in 1886 to 7 and 1887 to 8, even better water regions, including around Tabora, were less resilient. There is even famine across Unyamwezi, even around Tabora. The White Fathers' record suggests that a major factor in this famine was that most farmers planted maize at the outset of the 1886 rainy season. You can kind of see the logic behind this. If the rains arrived on time, which the sources suggest they did, might indicate a possibility of replenishing stores with a high yield crop. Also responding to high demand by the passing of ever larger caravans and the growth of population centers. But there's a failure of rains in December to February, which caused these crops to just completely fail. This time there's no new crops because they'd all failed because they relied on maize. At the same time, the stores from previous years had been diminished. Thus, there is increased tension here as stores decreased between heightened demand for food from people who did not produce food and need to be resilient to the effects of drought. And the former, in this instance, won out, and this contributed to famine in the late 1880s. And this has been a pattern that has been perpetuated ever since. Colonial rulers prioritized maize because it is a more viable cash crop. In good rainfall years, surpluses could be generated and sold. And this, of course, decreased levels of resilience to drought in the region's agricultural regimes. Post-colonial governments then doubled down, especially in the 1960s and 70s. In Tanzania, in instituting ujamaa, or collectivization, this was partly underpinned by the adoption of new high-yield strains of maize. The aim was partly to relieve labor from food production so that the nation could focus on producing higher value crops to export, including cotton, which again is reliant on abundant rainfall. It is only since the 1980s that this policy and others like them have been seriously reconsidered. And you can again discuss the influence of some devastating droughts, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. That's their kind of two possibilities. The growth of strands of maize that have higher levels of resistance. There's two possibilities to kind of build on here. That you can either try and grow strands of maize that have higher levels of resistance to drought, or grow strands of sorghum that have higher potential yields while not compromising its overall resistance to drought. And this is very much part of GMO crops is a big part of this. So I suppose I've touched on a few issues here, and I've definitely glossed over the 20th century aspects here, and then also the 21st. And as I said, I'd really value some feedback. I also value some feedback on the historical methodology of using using maps and GIS as a way of kind of suggesting ways in which agricultural practices changed over time in the 19th century. But just some kind of rough conclusions, which again, feedback on these would be really valued. The history of sorghum in Africa generally is pretty neglected. Most scholarship, historical and otherwise, is focused on the impact of crops introduced into the 19th century, such as especially maize. And then these were then dramatically expanded in the 20th century as well. But I think centering sorghum in history centers the importance of resilience to the effects of drought, which is a clear feature of the region's 19th century agricultural revolution. And this kind of building of resilience to drought will be integral to the region under global warming scenarios as well. Moreover, it's not just the expansion of maize that contributed to declining levels of resilience in the late 19th and 20th centuries. It was actually more, I suppose, the retraction of the growth of sorghum. And I suppose there's coming to some broader conclusion about mixed grain farming as practiced in the 19th century as maybe a model to building resilience to the effects of climatic extremes and the present and future, but I don't think that's particularly controversial. And when I say I want feedback on the conclusion here, I think the conclusion that mixed grain farming is good for building resilience isn't particularly original, it isn't particularly novel. I think some more precision could be added here. And I hope that anybody who's interested in this will maybe provide me some, will be able to provide some ideas. But thank you very much for this kind of for listening and watching this kind of very rough presentation. And as I said, I really value feedback on it.